Before we speak about the universe, let us take a moment simply to be here. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to understand. If you are lying down, allow your body to find the position that feels most at ease. If you are sitting, let your shoulders drop just a little. Not because anything is wrong, but because tonight there is nothing you need to hold. We are used to receiving knowledge as a kind of race. Information follows information. Facts demand to be remembered. Understanding demands to be proven. But tonight, science does not need to hurry. No one will ask you later how much you remember. There is no test waiting ahead. There is nothing you must carry with you into tomorrow morning. What you are about to hear is not told so that you memorize it, but so that you listen, because there are kinds of understanding that do not live in memory, but in sensation. Like when you look at the night sky, you do not need to know the name of every star to feel yourself become smaller and lighter. Science, when told slowly, is no longer a collection of numbers or terms. It becomes a whisper, a quiet reminder that this universe is larger than every worry you are carrying and far more silent than the thoughts racing through your mind. In this opening, you do not need to imagine the entire universe. You do not need to picture distances of millions of light years. You do not need to force yourself to understand things that sound distant or abstract. You only need to know one simple thing. The universe does not move according to the hurried rhythm of humans. The greatest processes that have ever occurred made no sound. The deepest changes happen in silence. Stars are not impatient as they form. Galaxies do not worry about whether they have meaning. Nothing in space feels as though it is falling behind some plan. Only humans so often feel that they are late. And perhaps that is why stories about the universe can return us to a state of rest. Because when you listen to things that unfold beyond the pace of your busy life, the mind begins to allow itself to slow down as well. Tonight, you do not need to follow every detail. If a thought passes by and you do not catch it, let it drift on. There is no loss here. What truly matters will remain on its own, and what is not needed tonight may be gently set down. Think of the stories ahead as a quiet orbit. You do not need to control it. Simply allow yourself to be carried. Some truths about the universe sound almost like fiction. Too strange, too different from what feels familiar. But those very things remind us of something important. This world was never built to fit perfectly within human intuition. And that is not as frightening as we often imagine. Sometimes not understanding everything is a form of safety. Tonight, you are allowed not to try to become smarter. You do not need to be the keeper of truth. You do not need to find the final answer. You only need to be here within this slow rhythm of telling where science does not run and awareness is not pulled tight. If your eyes begin to feel heavier, that does not mean you are missing something. It is a sign that the mind has stopped standing guard. And as we move forward into the strange yet real stories of the universe, remember this: you do not need to understand the universe completely to be allowed to rest within it. And now we can continue, very slowly. As the rhythm of the telling has slowed, as you no longer feel the need to keep up with anything at all. Perhaps this is the right moment to step into another layer of the story. Not a layer of new knowledge, but a layer of how we have learned to believe what is real. There are things in the universe that when we hear them for the first time, almost make us smile in disbelief. Not because they are wrong, but because they sit so far outside what we are used to. They sound like inventions, like stories embroidered for dramatic effect, like details that feel unnecessary. And that reaction is deeply human. We often judge what is real and what is false not by evidence but by familiarity. What resembles our experience we trust. What lies beyond our habitual frame of perception we doubt. Not because we lack reason, but because the human mind was built to seek safety, not absolute truth. Carl Jung once wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, "The mind that is not baffled is not employed. A mind that has never been confused is a mind that has never truly been used." The universe in its own way keeps placing us in that state of confusion, not through threat, but through strangeness. Truths that sound impossible. Phenomena that run against intuition. Laws that do not ask for human agreement. We once believed the Earth was the center, not because of data, but because the ground beneath our feet felt still. We once believed time flowed evenly, not because it was true, but because the clock on the wall suggested stability. We once believed that only what seemed reasonable could exist, but the universe has never signed a contract to make sense for us. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "There are no facts, only interpretations. Not everything is fiction, but the way we touch truth always passes through the filter of interpretation. And that filter is woven from memory, culture, fear, and the need to feel safe. Perhaps that is why when a truth sounds too strange, we quickly place it in the category of unreliable, just to keep our inner world from being shaken. But if we look again very slowly, we may notice something. Gentle strangeness is not the exception of the universe. It is the rule, not because the universe wants to impress us, but because it was never built around human intuition. Dostoevsky once let a character say in Notes from Underground, "What is the good of reason if it must always justify?" Perhaps our reason was not born to justify everything, but to endure not understanding at all. Seen from that angle, truths that sound like fiction no longer feel like a threat. They become a quiet reminder that the world is far wider than anything we can become accustomed to. And that does not strip human life of meaning. On the contrary, it frees us from the burden of needing to be the center. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Accept the things to which fate binds you and love the people with whom fate brings you together. Acceptance is not surrender, it is placing oneself correctly." Perhaps when we stop demanding that the universe be easy to understand, the mind also stops straining to control. Strange things, when not forced to explain themselves, immediately become very calm. They are like the night sky. You do not need to know why it is so deep to feel peaceful while looking up. And perhaps this is the quiet gift of truths that sound unreal. They allow us to release the need to grasp everything. They teach us that not understanding it all does not mean being left behind. Tonight, if something you hear makes you quietly think, "That doesn't sound real at all," let that feeling stay without argument. Not every question needs to be answered before you sleep. The universe was operating for a very long time before humans asked questions about it, and it will continue to operate even while we are resting. Within that flow, you do not need to stay alert to guard it. You do not need to understand to be allowed to exist. You only need to know this strangeness is not a sign of chaos, but a trace of an order too vast for human intuition to hold. And when awareness touches that limit, it may rest, very gently. After the mind has accepted that strangeness is not an exception but a natural part of the universe, we can take one more step, lighter, deeper. Not to travel farther through space, but to touch a very familiar feeling in a very distant place. There is a region in the galaxy where there is no warm light of the sun, no sound, no life as we know it. Only gas dust and time. And yet within that cold emptiness, humans have discovered molecules that carry the scent of alcohol and the flavor of berries. It sounds like an embellished story, like a detail too poetic to be true. And perhaps that is precisely why it makes us pause a little longer. Not because we think it is false, but because it feels familiar in a very strange way. Those molecules in human life are tied to memory, the smell of fermentation, the sweetness of ripe fruit, evenings conversations, moments that are deeply human, and then they appear in a place completely without humans. Not as a metaphor, but as a simple chemical fact. Organic chemistry does not need meaning to exist. It only needs the right conditions. Complex molecules can form on their own drift, on their own, exist on their own, in darkness stretching for millions of years. There is no creative hand placing them there, no intention, no purpose. And it is precisely this that makes the discovery strangely gentle, because it invites a very quiet question. If familiar ingredients can exist in places utterly unfamiliar, then where does the boundary truly lie between the familiar and the strange? Perhaps what we call familiar is not so, because it is rare, but because we have encountered it in our own lives. And what we call strange is simply what has not yet been given a memory to name it. Carl Jung once wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. What is unfamiliar is not the same as what is threatening. It can also be the source of the deepest connection." When humans find molecules that evoke familiar scents and tastes in the cold of space, it is not a moment of scientific triumph. It is a moment when the universe leans in slightly and whispers, "I am not as lifeless as you once thought." Not in the sense that the universe has feelings, but in the sense that it is not absolutely distant. The atoms in your body and the atoms drifting in that cloud follow the same laws. They do not know who you are, but they are not strangers to you either. They once lived in stars that burned out. They once wandered through darkness, and now they form you breathing, listening, slowly sinking into stillness. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, And when you look long into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you. But sometimes when we look into the universe, what looks back is not an abyss, but familiarity at the deepest level. Not familiar because it is the same, but familiar because it is made from the same foundation. Perhaps what makes this discovery healing is not the molecules themselves, but the feeling that this world is not entirely cold. Not because it cares about us, but because it is not as alien to us as we once believed. In everyday life, we often feel lost when we cannot find something familiar. But the universe reminds us familiarity does not always need a familiar shape. Sometimes it only needs a shared origin, Dostoevsky wrote in The Brothers Karamazov. The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. Perhaps what is worth living for is not always a grand meaning. Sometimes it is simply the feeling that we are not completely cut off from everything else. When you hear about a cloud that smells of alcohol and berries, you do not need to remember its name. You do not need to remember its chemical formula. You do not need to remember where it is. Just allow one very light feeling to remain within you that this universe, no matter how vast it is, still carries within it traces that are not entirely unfamiliar. And when that feeling stays, the mind can release some of its need to defend itself. Not all emptiness is truly empty. Not all silence is loneliness. Tonight, as your awareness slowly drifts, let this image remain familiar molecules quietly floating in the dark, needing no witness, needing no understanding. They exist, and that is enough. And perhaps for humans, it is the same. You do not need to stand at the center of the universe to be allowed to rest within it. Now we can continue to drift very slowly. While the image of familiar molecules quietly drifting through distant darkness still lingers somewhere in the mind, we can continue forward, not faster, only wider. Not to search for more strangeness, but to look again at the larger picture, the place where all that strangeness is born in the most unassuming way. If we step back just a little, the universe no longer appears as a cold, empty void, but as a space quietly at work. Not loudly, with no guiding hand, no pre-written plan. Only matter, energy, and time patiently mixing. Everywhere in space, chemical reactions unfold without the need for an observer. Molecules join and separate. Complex structures slowly emerge from very simple components. No living thing stands there commanding them to exist. They appear because conditions allow them to. In this sense, the universe resembles a vast kitchen with the flame always set very low. No recipe, no final dish to complete, only process. Prebiotic molecules, the rough building blocks of life, are formed without any living beings present. They do not know what they will become. They carry no goal. They simply react to their surroundings. And within that indifference, something quietly profound occurs. The ingredients of life are not rare. Water, carbon, hydrogen. The most basic elements are also the most common. Perhaps what makes life on Earth feel special is not the rarity of its materials, but the fact that they were given enough time. Time to fail and try again. Time to combine and dissolve. Time to wait for a structure stable enough to continue existing. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Observe constantly that all things take place by change. Everything unfolds through change. Not by sudden leaps, but by very small adjustments repeated across spans of time that humans can scarcely imagine." Seen this way, the question of life softens considerably. It is no longer, why do we exist, but rather, in a universe that is always experimenting, why would life not appear? Perhaps life is not a rare miracle, but a natural possibility once conditions mature. What may be rare is not life itself, but life lasting long enough to ask questions about itself. Carl Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order. Within chaos there is always a quiet order, not an order of meaning, but an order of possibility." When we see the universe as a kitchen, we do not need to believe that it is cooking life for some higher purpose. It is enough to accept this matter when left undisturbed. Long enough will try every possibility it can. And among those countless attempts, some structures happen to be stable enough to continue. Perhaps this is what makes the idea of life both humbling and comforting. Humbling because we were not the intended outcome. Comforting because we are not a solitary accident. Dostoevsky wrote in The Idiot Beauty Will Save the World. Perhaps the beauty he spoke of lies not in form, but in the fact that things can arise without needing a reason. In human life, we often grow weary from having to find meaning in everything. But the universe does not. It allows things to happen before the question, what for, is ever asked. And when we allow ourselves to rest within that perspective, a familiar burden begins to fall away. You do not need a grand purpose to be allowed to exist. You do not need to prove that you deserve to live. Like those molecules, you are here because conditions allowed it. Tonight, as you listen to a universe quietly blending its most basic ingredients, let one very gentle thought remain. Perhaps life is not as fragile as we fear. It is simply quieter than we imagine. And perhaps you do not need to strain yourself to hold on to existence. In a kitchen with no ticking clock, no dish that must be finished on time, everything is allowed to wait, including you. Now let this stream of thought slow down, and if sleep arrives, allow it to complete the rest. As the idea of the universe as a quiet kitchen still drifts gently through the mind where everything is mixed, without purpose, without a final result to aim for, we can allow our thoughts to shift toward another image, not to leave that kitchen behind, but to look at one dish created under conditions entirely unlike those of Earth. There are planets not made of familiar rock with no liquid water, no gentle atmosphere to shelter life. Instead, they carry within them a structure that makes humans pause without meaning to. Carbon compressed under unimaginable pressure. Matter crystallized in a way that on Earth we call precious. A diamond planet. The name alone is enough to awaken the imagination, enough to trigger our inherited ideas of value. Sparkling, rare, desirable. But if we remain with that image just a little longer, not with a gaze of desire but with slow attention, a quiet paradox begins to appear. A world that may be composed of the very thing humans treasure most is entirely unsuited for life. No place to breathe, no water to flow, no margin of stillness where any fragile organism could survive. Sparkling yet silent. And in that moment, the universe once again rests a gentle hand upon humanity's deepest assumptions. We are used to defining value from our own point of view. What is rare on Earth we call precious. What serves human life we call meaningful. But the universe does not share that frame of reference. A diamond planet is not a treasure. It is simply the natural outcome of physical conditions different from those where we live. No intention to impress. No message. No invitation. Only matter arranging itself in the way it can. Epictetus wrote in Enchiridion, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things." It is not things themselves that unsettle us, but the way we look at them. A diamond planet does not make the universe richer. It merely reveals more clearly the bias in human perception. We often carry Earth's measuring sticks and press them onto the entire universe. We call a world special because it resembles our home. We call a world valuable because it aligns with our needs. But the universe does not need to resemble Earth to be allowed to exist. And that world, no matter how much it sparkles, does not need life to be considered complete. Perhaps what makes this image healing is not the luxury of diamonds, but the universe's indifference. It favors nothing. It excludes nothing. It does not strive to create an ending that fits anyone's expectations. In human life, we often grow tired from constantly having to prove our worth, to be useful, to be suitable, to resemble some model declared to be right. But that diamond planet exists without needing any permission. It does not sustain life. It serves no purpose. It offers no benefit, and it is still there, whole. Perhaps this is the quietest lesson the universe can offer humanity. You do not need to resemble Earth to have value. You do not need to be livable by someone else's standards to be allowed to exist. Value seen from the universe is not an absolute measure, only a temporary perspective. When we allow ourselves to see the world this way, many pressures begin to dissolve. You do not need to sparkle. You do not need to be rare. You do not need to become something special in the eyes of others. Like that planet, you can exist simply because you are the result of conditions that have occurred. No more, no less. Tonight, as the image of a world made of diamonds quietly passes through your mind, let one very gentle feeling remain that the universe does not judge you by Earth's standards. And perhaps you do not need to judge yourself so harshly either. A sparkling world may not be meant for life. And an ordinary life can still be complete without sparkle. When that thought lingers, the mind can release the need to become something else. Now let this stream of thought continue to drift slower, lighter, until sleep finds you on its own without needing to be called by name. As the image of a diamond planet quietly closes, not like a climax, but like a question left open, perhaps what lingers longest is not the brilliance of matter, but a vague sensation that what we call valuable has begun to loosen. Not because it is wrong, but because it depends too much on where we happen to stand. On Earth, diamonds are symbols of rarity, of desire, of value framed through the human gaze. But remove them from that context, away from need, away from memory, away from the silent agreements of society, and diamonds immediately become quiet. Not good, not bad, not important. Just carbon arranged in a particular way. The universe does not object to the values humans assign to things. It simply does not participate in that conversation. And it is precisely this indifference that makes all standards more fragile than we expect. We often believe that value resides within things themselves, that something is worthy because it carries some objective quality. But the farther we look, the more slowly we look, the more clearly we see that value does not live in matter itself, but in the relationship between humans and that matter. David Hume wrote in a treatise of human nature, beauty, "In things exist merely in the mind which contemplates them. Beauty does not dwell in objects, but in the mind that beholds them, and value is no different. Diamonds are priceless not because of their crystal structure, but because humans have agreed to treat them as symbols, an agreement sustained long enough to feel self-evident. But the universe, vast beyond all agreements, keeps reminding us nothing is self-evident forever. What we consider rare may be common elsewhere. What we deem essential may be entirely unnecessary in another context. And when those standards begin to waver, a very familiar feeling often arises in human life: unease. Because if value is not fixed, if meaning is not guaranteed, then what do we rely on to know we are living correctly? Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in The Will to Power, "There are no moral phenomena at all, only a moral interpretation of phenomena. There are no moral facts in themselves, only the ways we interpret them." The universe, through its vast and impartial scale, does not deny human interpretations, but it does not confirm them either. It leaves things as they are, bare, without labels, and in that moment we may feel very small, but also very free. Because if value is an agreement, then it can be adjusted, loosened, or set down, at least for tonight. In everyday life, we carry countless invisible measures: success, failure, good enough, not enough. These measures act like gravity, pulling the mind downward, not allowing rest. But when we look at the universe long enough, we begin to realize that these measures are not etched into the structure of reality. They were placed there to help humans live together more easily, not to turn life into an exam that lasts a lifetime. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." Very little is required for a peaceful life. The rest lies in how we look. Perhaps when we accept that value does not reside in rarity, but in perspective, an old burden begins to dissolve. You do not need to be rare to have value. You do not need to be extraordinary to deserve existence. Just as diamonds become meaningless on a cosmic scale, many human worries grow lighter when placed within a wider context. Not because they do not matter, but because they do not need to carry the entire meaning of life. Tonight, as you listen to values that once felt solid, now appearing fragile, let that not disturb you. Fragile does not mean meaningless. Sometimes, because they are not fixed, they can be set down. You do not need to reach any standard to be allowed to rest. In a universe that does not measure by human eyes, your existence is already enough. And as that thought settles in the mind, sleep may arrive not as a reward, but as a natural state. Now let all measures fall away for a while. No need to decide anything. No need to judge anything. Just be here in a moment unweighed, where value does not need to be proven and the mind is allowed to rest. When the measures of value have been set down for a while, when the mind is no longer stretched by comparison, another question arises quite naturally, not loudly, not urgently, not a question about what matters, but about what is flowing. We call it time. In everyday life, time hangs on walls, rests on wrists, glows on screens. It is divided, measured, arranged into schedules. But the universe once again does not follow this human habit. There are places in space where time flows more slowly. Not in an emotional sense, but in a physical one. Near extreme masses such as black holes, time stretches. A single moment there can correspond to many years elsewhere. There is no single timeline for the entire universe. Only different rates of flow depending on where you stand. And when we accept this, a very familiar idea begins to dissolve, that time is an absolute stream fare, the same for everyone. In truth, time was never like that. St. Augustine wrote in Confessions, Book 11, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I know not." We know time only when we do not have to define it. The moment we try to grasp it, it slips through our fingers. Perhaps that is because time is not an object but an experience. A minute of waiting can feel endless. An hour of peace can pass very quickly. Not because the clock is wrong, but because awareness is participating in the flow. The universe confirms this in a cold, impartial way. Time depends on position. Humans feel this in an intimate way. Time depends on the state of mind. When anxious time stretches, when settled time softens. And perhaps this is where science and lived experience touch each other gently. Not to explain one another, but to whisper the same truth. Time is not your enemy. It is not chasing you. It is not urging you on. It is not judging whether you are slow or fast. Only humans do that to themselves. Seneca wrote in on the shortness of life, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." But perhaps wasting time here does not only mean doing meaningless things, but living in a rhythm of time that is not your own. Living too fast for your capacity to feel. Living too hurried for your inner needs. The universe with its regions where time stretches teaches us a very quiet lesson. There is no single pace that is right for everyone. And therefore there is no single way of living that is right for everyone. Some lives bloom very slowly. Some moments require a great deal of time to ripen. Not because you are delaying, but because you are in a different frame of reference. In modern life, we often judge living by speed. Fast or slow, early or late, on time or behind schedule. But if time does not flow the same everywhere, perhaps life too does not need to be lived at the same pace. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Do not act as if you had 10,000 years to live. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." Not a call to rush, but a reminder to be with the moment you have. Not running ahead of it, not pulling it backward, just being with it. Tonight, as you lie here and let this slow narration pass, you do not need to fall asleep quickly. You do not need to reach any particular state. Sleep, too, has its own sense of time. It cannot be forced. It cannot be pulled. It arrives when the mind stops counting. Perhaps what black holes teach us is not their grandeur, but this very simple truth: time is softer than we imagine. And therefore life can be lived more softly as well. You do not need to catch up with anyone. You do not need to keep pace with an invisible clock. You do not need to prove that you are using time correctly. In a universe where time bends, stretches, and flows differently in every place, the fact that you are here in this slow rhythm is entirely valid. Now let awareness release its tracking of time. No need to know how long it has been. No need to know how much remains. Just be here in an unmeasured moment. And if sleep arrives, let it come in its own rhythm. Very slowly, very naturally. When awareness has stopped measuring time, when the different rhythms of the universe have begun to soften the feeling of urgency, we can touch a story even deeper, the story of beginnings. Not the beginning of a day, not the beginning of a human life, but the beginning of everything we have ever known. We call it the Big Bang. The name itself already evokes a very human image, a great explosion, a violent moment, a central point from which everything is hurled outward. But the universe once again does not operate according to the images human intuition is accustomed to. The Big Bang was not an explosion that happened somewhere in space. It had no sound, no center, no boundary for an explosion to reach. The Big Bang was the opening of space itself. Space was not filled with matter. Space was born together with matter. There is no place you can point to and say, that is the center of the universe, because everywhere is the center, and therefore nowhere is the center. Every galaxy looking outward sees everything else moving away, not because they are fleeing, but because the distance between them is growing. Everything is drifting apart, very slowly, very patiently. There was no violent jolt pushing the universe forward, only a continuous loosening like a long breath that has never been drawn back in. Albert Einstein once wrote, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible." Perhaps that is only true when we stop trying to understand it through the image of explosions. When we allow ourselves to see the beginning not as a violent event, but as a process of opening. A beginning that does not break, but allows. A beginning that does not shove, but expands. No center also means no privileged position. Earth is not in the middle. Humans do not stand at the center. There is no place chosen as the main stage. And this, when contemplated long enough, does not make us smaller. It makes us lighter. Because if there is no center, we do not need to strive to become the center. If there is no edge, we do not need to fear falling out. In a universe opening everywhere, existence is not a position to compete for. It is simply a state that is permitted. Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, "Not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. What is mystical is not how the world operates, but that it exists at all." Seen this way, the Big Bang is no longer a story about a distant moment that closed long ago. It is a movement that is still continuing. Space is still opening. Distances are still stretching. Galaxies are still drifting. There is no ending being aimed at, no destination that must be reached, only the quiet continuation of opening. And when we place human life within that flow, a very different question arises. If the universe did not explode to begin, why do we so often feel that our lives must begin with a violent push? Why do we believe that change must be loud, that beginnings must be dramatic, that meaning must be created through decisive moments? The universe does not need that. It simply opens, very slowly, very evenly. Perhaps human life too can be allowed the same grace. No dramatic turning point is required to be worthy. No explosion is needed to justify existence. You can begin by loosening, by allowing more space, by not forcing yourself to be somewhere within a grand diagram. In a universe with no center, you do not need to be the anchor of everything. In a universe with no edge, you do not need to fear that you are too far away. Tonight, as you hear of a beginning that was not a bang, let that image touch your breath very gently. An opening that does not demand, does not push, does not judge. It simply creates more space. And perhaps that is exactly what your mind needs most right now. Not more answers, not more meaning, but more room to rest. When everything is drifting apart very slowly, you do not need to run. You are already within the movement. Now let awareness drift with this opening rhythm. No need to track it. No need to understand it all. No need to hold on to anything. The universe is still opening, and you are allowed to rest within that opening. As the image of a beginning without an explosion continues to drift gently through awareness, as the feeling of opening has softened the mind enough that it no longer holds itself shut, we can keep drifting with another movement of the universe. Not a beginning, not an ending, but motion itself, continuous quiet, unceasing. The universe is not still, but that does not mean it is in a hurry. There is no frantic counting, no destination that must be reached sooner. Nothing is left behind when motion unfolds slowly. Space is expanding. The distances between galaxies are growing. Everything is drifting away from everything else. And what is striking is this: the greatest of these movements makes no sound, no thunder, no warning, no moment we could call a start. Only change happening little by little, so steadily that humans can only notice it by looking back over long stretches of time. Heraclitus once wrote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." Not because the river is rushing, but because it is always flowing. The universe is the same. Not still, but not hurried. Its movement does not require anyone's attention. No audience. No recognition. It happens because it is its nature. And when we allow ourselves to stay with that image a little longer, a very quiet metaphor begins to form. Human life is often told through major moments: success, failure, turning points, decisions. But most of life does not unfold in those moments. It happens in unnamed days, in repeated evenings, in changes too small to be called progress. Like the universe, we often move without realizing it. We change in silence. We grow without hearing a sound. We drift away from earlier versions of ourselves bit by bit. And because it is not loud, these movements are often judged as not enough, not fast enough, not clear enough, not significant enough. But the universe does not need recognition to continue expanding. It does not worry about whether it is on the right path. It does not compare its speed to another universe. It simply continues. Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "Everything which is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. Everything exists within an order larger than itself." Perhaps what makes this metaphor healing is not the universe's vastness, but its pace. A pace that does not demand, does not pressure, does not judge. In human life, we often carry a heavy feeling, the feeling of being behind others, behind expectations, behind the plans we once made for ourselves. But if the universe can move without haste, then perhaps being slow is not a mistake. Perhaps it is simply a different rhythm. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Nature does nothing uselessly, nature does nothing in vain, and slow movement does not mean useless movement. It is simply harder to notice when we are accustomed to searching for dramatic change. The universe does not shove galaxies apart with violent force. It simply allows the space between them to widen gradually. Nothing is forced. Nothing is torn from its place. And when we apply that way of seeing to our inner lives, something very gentle happens. We can allow ourselves to be changing without having to prove it. You may be expanding, loosening, drifting away from old tensions. No announcement needed, no timeline required. No one has to notice. Tonight, as you lie here and let this slow narration pass, remember this: the universe is moving even when it is very quiet. And so are you. Not every movement needs to be felt. Not every change needs to be named. Sometimes the only thing required is not to resist, not to push yourself to go faster, not to pull yourself backward. Just allow everything to continue flowing in its natural rhythm. In a universe that is not still yet, not rushed, you do not need to hurry to become someone. You are already in motion. And when awareness realizes this, it can release a very old fear, the fear of standing still. No, you are drifting, very gently. Now let that flow continue without tracking it, without guiding it. The greatest movements happen in silence, and sleep does too. When we have grown accustomed to the idea that the universe is always moving without the need to hurry, that profound changes can unfold in silence. Another question begins to emerge, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to look farther. If the universe does not favor speed, does it favor life? We are used to seeing Earth as an exception, a rare point of light, a chosen place, not out of pride, but because we are here. And the experience of being present always makes one's own place feel special. But as science reaches farther, as our gaze expands beyond familiar boundaries, a very quiet possibility appears. Earth may not be an exception, not the only world that ever held potential for life, not the universe's only attempt. There are planets that once came very close, close enough for water to exist, close enough for atmospheres to form, close enough for chemistry to have a chance to begin. Mars with traces of ancient flows. Venus once possibly far more temperate than it is now. Near misses, potentials that never fully took shape. Paths that turned away from long-lasting life. Not because they lacked ingredients, but because they lacked stability. Life seen from a great enough distance is not a guaranteed state. It is a fragile process requiring prolonged balance among many factors. And when even one shifts, everything can change. Hannah Arendt wrote, "In the human condition, mortality is distinct from mere life is the hallmark of the human condition." Finitude is not a flaw, but the signature of existence. When human life is placed within a cosmic context, that idea does not grow heavier. It becomes more honest. There are no eternal promises, no contracts that last forever, no guarantee that once life appears, it will continue. The universe signs no agreements with any form of life. And strangely enough, this does not render life meaningless. It makes life precious in a different way, not because it is rare, but because it is temporary. Albert Camus wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. A struggle does not need a promised ending to have value. Perhaps life is the same. It does not need to be guaranteed forever to be worth living fully." When we look at Mars or Venus not as failures, but as different attempts within the same process, a very gentle perspective emerges. The universe is not cruel. It simply does not prioritize outcomes. It allows possibilities and lets time decide. Earth in this light is not a final reward. It is a moment in progress, a temporary balance among countless other possibilities, and therefore life on Earth does not need to carry the burden of representing the universe. It only needs to be lived. In human life, we often seek safety through guarantees that something will always remain, that a relationship will endure, that a state will not change. But the universe with worlds that once neared life and then quietly turned elsewhere reminds us nothing is preserved by existing forever. Life is not sustained by promises. It is sustained by care in the present. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Do not dwell on the past, do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." Not because the present is everything, but because it is the only place where life is truly happening. When you know that life is not self-evident, you do not need to be afraid. You can become gentler, gentler with mistakes, gentler with pauses, gentler with yourself. You do not need to live as if everything must last forever. You only need to live as if this moment is real. Tonight, as you hear about worlds that once held potential and then quietly shifted course, let one very calm thought remain: the fact that Earth holds life is not a promise. It is an open gift. And like all fragile gifts, it does not need to last forever to have meaning. It only needs to be cherished while it is here. Now let awareness hold nothing more. No need to worry about tomorrow, no need to repair the past. In a universe where life is not guaranteed, the fact that you are breathing, listening, resting is already enough. And if sleep arrives, allow it to come as a natural part of the moment that is unfolding. When the idea that life is not guaranteed has settled long enough in the mind, when Earth is no longer seen as a chosen exception but as a moment in progress, another image begins to appear. Not loudly, not tragically. Earth seen from the universe is not a solid fortress. It is more like a temporary survivor. Not because it is weak, but because it is held together by a balance so fragile that even a very small change could have made everything different. A distance just right from the sun. An axial tilt not too extreme. A quiet magnetic field offering protection. A moon large enough to stabilize motion. None of these conditions appear grand. They do not impress. They do not announce themselves. Yet remove just one, and the story would have turned another way. Life on Earth does not endure because of a single decisive factor. It endures because many things are right at the same time. And this very fact makes existence here both miraculous and very easy to lose. Nothing is anchored to a permanent foundation. Heraclitus once said, "Nothing endures but change. Nothing lasts forever except change itself." But change, when seen slowly enough, is no longer a threat. It is the breathing rhythm of everything that lives. Over billions of years, Earth has passed through moments when balance nearly failed. Ice ages, atmospheric transformations, cosmic impacts. Life did not vanish instantly, but neither did it remain unchanged. It adapted, contracted, shifted form. And throughout all these movements, no promises were made. No one guaranteed that the current balance would last forever. At first glance, this can feel unsettling, but if we stay with it long enough, another feeling begins to arise, a very quiet one. Because if nothing is certain, then nothing is forced to remain fixed. There is no state you must hold on to forever out of fear of losing it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Strength does not lie in controlling the external world, but in how we remain present with uncertainty. Earth does not exist because it controls every variable. It exists because it continually adapts within a very narrow margin. And perhaps this is the closest metaphor for human life. We often grow tired from trying to secure certainty, an unchanging plan, a relationship that never wavers, an identity that is never questioned. But the world does not operate that way. Life is sustained by things that seem small, a conversation that arrives in time, a decision to slow down, a pause that is allowed. Shift one condition and the sense of safety can disappear. Adjust one thing back and everything can continue. Albert Camus wrote in The Plague, "The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart, not because of victory, but because continuing is already a form of living." When we see Earth as a temporary survivor, we do not need to become pessimistic. We can be gentler with our instabilities, gentler with uncertain days, gentler with not knowing where things will lead. Nothing being certain does not mean everything is meaningless. It simply means meaning does not reside in guarantees. It resides in how we inhabit this moment. Tonight, as you hear about a planet held together by fragile balances, let one very light thought remain: the fact that you are here is not self-evident, but it does not need justification. You do not need certainty about tomorrow to be allowed to rest today. Like Earth, you are existing within a moment of balance, not perfect, not permanent, but enough. And perhaps the most healing thing is not to seek certainty, but to allow yourself to rest within uncertainty. When we stop resisting fragility, it stops frightening us. It becomes a natural part of being alive. Now, let awareness hold nothing more. No guarantees, no promises. In a universe where nothing is certain, the fact that you are breathing more slowly, listening, allowing the mind to rest is already a complete balance. And if sleep arrives, let it come the way Earth continues to turn quietly fragile and still here. When awareness has accepted that Earth is only a temporary balance, when fragility no longer causes fear, but becomes a gentle ground for the mind to rest upon, perhaps it is time to shift our gaze one step further, not farther away, but closer, very close. For in the journey through vast distances, through unfamiliar planets and fragile equilibria, one thing is often forgotten. You are not only living in the universe, you are carrying the universe within you. The human body, seen from far enough away, is no different from a complex natural system. It glows not with dazzling light, but with biochemical reactions quietly unfolding every second. It regenerates cells, new cells are born even when you are not paying attention. It changes every day without permission, without a plan, without a predetermined meaning. And all of this happens silently, the way stars form without needing an observer. We often think of the body as something we own, a tool to be used, something that must be controlled. But if we look more slowly, more widely, we may see something very different. Your body is not a static object. It is a process, a flow of matter, energy, and time. Heraclitus once said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice. No one steps into the same river twice. And no one wakes up in the same body twice either." The version of you right now is already different from the version of you a few hours ago. Not because your personality changed, but because the matter that composes you is constantly being renewed. When we realize this, a very strange feeling appears. We do not need to do anything to continue existing. So much is already happening on its own. Carl Jung wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. The psyche is a self-regulating system. The mind regulates itself, and the body does as well. You do not need to command your heart to beat. You do not need to remind your lungs to breathe. You do not need to remember what each cell must do next. There is a natural intelligence operating you every second. And that intelligence does not require you to understand it. The human body, therefore, is not something separate from nature. It is a natural phenomenon unfolding very near. Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "The human mind is part of the infinite intellect of God." Whether we call it nature, the universe, or the order of existence, the idea whispers the same thing. You are not outside this world. You are within it and made of it. In everyday life, we often feel lost, as if we are exceptions, creatures that must strain themselves to survive in a foreign world. But if your body is made of the same atoms that once existed in stars, if the laws that govern galaxies are also governing your cells, then that sense of alienation can be revisited very gently. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "All things are interwoven with one another, and the bond is sacred." Everything is interwoven, and that bond is sacred. Not in a religious sense, but in the sense that it cannot be separated. Your body is not an isolated object struggling to exist. It is a point of intersection between earth, water, air, and time. And because of this, the strange things that happen within you are not errors, not abnormalities. They are signs that you are alive. Unexplained fatigue, changes you cannot name, very small sensations that cannot be explained. All of them are movement, just like the universe. When we see our bodies this way, we can set down a very familiar burden, the pressure to always be stable, always consistent, always the same as yesterday. The universe does not demand that, and neither does your body. Tonight, as you listen to this slow narration, let one very calm thought remain. You do not need to control everything happening within you. So many things already know how to continue. You do not need to fix yourself to be allowed to rest. Just as stars do not need to understand themselves in order to keep shining, you do not need to understand your body, your mind, or the path ahead to be allowed to sleep. In this moment, you are not an isolated individual. You are a very small part of a very large process unfolding gently. And when awareness touches that feeling, it can let go. No defense, no effort. Just allow the body to do what it has done for millions of years of evolution continue. Self-regulate, and rest when night falls. If sleep comes, let it come like another natural phenomenon. No need to name it, no need to track it. You are already in the right place. When our gaze has returned to the body, when we realize that we do not stand outside the universe, but carry it within every breath, a very familiar door begins to open. Not a door leading outward, but a door leading inward. Sleep. In modern life, sleep is often misunderstood as an empty space between two working days, as an interruption, as time spent doing nothing. But the body and the universe within it has never seen sleep that way. When you sleep, the brain does not shut down. It simply changes how it works. Regions once busy with language, with control, with orientation begin to grow quiet. Other regions, those linked to memory, emotion, and deep integration, awaken in a very different rhythm. Sleep is not a void, it is a state in which consciousness is allowed to set down its role as supervisor. And when that roll is released, something very strange happens. Dreams appear. Not entirely science, not entirely mystery. Dreams are like an in-between space where the data of yesterday is rearranged according to rules that do not require linear logic. Images overlap, time folds in on itself, characters shift and transform. And within all that apparent irrationality, the brain is doing something very serious, connecting, filtering, healing. Sigmund Freud once wrote in The Interpretation of Dreams, "Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, not because dreams always carry messages that must be decoded, but because they reveal that the mind never stops working even when you rest." Carl Jung later wrote in Man and His Symbols, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, a small door hidden deep within the most secret chambers of the soul. But tonight, you do not need to open that door. No need to interpret, no need to remember. Just know this: when you sleep, a deeper part of you continues." Sleep, therefore, is not a waste of time. It is the moment you stop trying. In waking life, we are used to control. Controlling thoughts, controlling emotions, controlling the image of who we are. But no one can control sleep. The harder you try to sleep, the farther it retreats. Sleep arrives only when you allow yourself not to achieve anything. Seneca wrote in Letters from a Stoic, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. But perhaps what we waste most is not time, but unconditional rest. We often allow ourselves to rest only after we have done enough, after work is finished, after we feel we have earned it. But the body does not operate by that moral code. It needs sleep not as a reward, but as a condition of existence. Sleep is when the body repairs itself, when memories are reorganized, when emotions are softened. And most importantly, sleep is when consciousness no longer has to strain. If daytime consciousness is like a train driver, then at night it is allowed to leave the cabin. The train keeps moving, but without a controller." Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Know where you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul. There is no place more peaceful than your own soul." Sleep does not take you away from yourself. It brings you back to a state before you had to define, to explain, to tense yourself into being someone. Tonight, as you hear these words, you do not need to follow them to the end. If a passage slips by that you do not remember, that is not a loss. It is a sign that consciousness is loosening its grip. You do not need to stay awake to hear it all. Sleep is not a thief of experience. It is the continuation of experience, a part that needs no words. When you sleep, you do not leave this journey. You simply change vehicles, from thought to sensation, from control to trust. And perhaps this is the deepest philosophical lesson sleep offers us. Not everything of value requires conscious participation. Not every process needs to be witnessed. Sometimes the wisest act is to set things down. Tonight, you do not need to understand anything more. No need to remember. No need to carry questions forward. Let the brain do what it evolved to do. Let the body continue its process of self-regulation. And if dreams arrive, let them come like an underground river flowing beneath the surface of awareness. No need to follow. No need to hold on. Just know this sleep is not disappearance. It is another way of remaining. Very gentle, very deep. When sleep is finally seen as a natural state, not something to be conquered, not a reward for a day well endured, something very light can happen. You begin to realize that you no longer need to carry everything with you. Throughout this journey, we have traveled very far, across vast spaces, past planets unlike Earth, through stretched time, through fragile life, through the body quietly sustaining itself. And if there is one thing that appears gently after all of this, perhaps it is this: the universe has never required that you understand it completely. Only humans tend to place that burden upon themselves. We are used to living in a state of holding on, holding answers, holding meaning, holding the feeling that everything must be explained in order to feel safe. But the universe does not operate on that kind of certainty. It opens without instructions. It continues without waiting for agreement. And it allows what is not yet understood to exist for a very long time without becoming a problem. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. The limits of language are the limits of what we can speak about. But the world does not end there. There are things that do not need to be named to be present. There are questions that do not need answers to be allowed to remain. And tonight, you do not need to resolve them. You do not need to understand every structure of the universe. You do not need to connect every philosophical fragment. You do not need to draw a neat conclusion to carry into sleep. You are allowed to set them down, like placing a heavy object aside after a long day. Not because it is meaningless, but because your hands need rest. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Nothing happens to any man that he is not formed by nature to bear." Nothing happens that you are not capable of bearing, but that does not mean you must bear everything at all times. There are moments when strength lies in letting go of questions without answers, letting go of the need to understand everything fully, letting go of the feeling that you are missing something if you do not keep up. The universe does not keep score. It does not grade. It does not require you to stay alert in order to deserve existence within it. And sleep at the end of this journey is not a departure. It is a gentle transition from effort to trust, from consciousness to natural process, from holding on to letting drift. Albert Camus wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. But perhaps after the struggle, what fills the heart is not continuing to push the stone, but allowing oneself to sit at the edge and breathe." Tonight, you do not need to become more knowledgeable. You do not need to become more clear. You do not need to go any farther. You only need to be here, in a moment that requires no proof. If a thought remains that refuses to leave you, do not need to push it away. Let it stay there like a thin cloud passing across the sky. You are not that sky. You are simply watching it. And when consciousness stops trying to control, sleep can arrive like an old friend without introduction. Quiet, unhurried, undemanding, simply staying with you until everything settles on its own. Tonight, you do not need to understand everything to be allowed to rest. You have already traveled far enough. Let the universe continue its movements. Let the body do what it knows how to do. Let sleep complete the rest. Very gentle, very still.